This is Sunday Night Praise with the Spooner Church of the Nazarene for today, Sunday, May 22nd, 2021. I'm Pastor Clifford Larrabee of the Spooner Church of the Nazarene. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I want to teach you about my heritage a little bit. I grew up in southern Dunn County, grew up in the Force Center Church of the Nazarene. Not only did I grow up in this church that my great-grandfather Lamont Larrabee and his brother, my great-uncle Charles Burt Larrabee, helped start along with evangelist Reverend Curtis, I pastored that church for 12 years. And I'm going to share with you from 2013 a video put together by my great friend and cousin, Brian Gabriel from Remember When Productions in Dunn County, Wisconsin. He made a 3-hour video called the 100th Anniversary of the Force Center Church of the Nazarene, first ever Nazarene church in Wisconsin. And it was over 3 hours, so I called Brian, or I texted him actually, or emailed him, and asked him if I had permission to edit that video down for our Sunday night praise program. So it'll be under an hour. And I just take the best of that program. I add a few things, and Brian did a great job with the video. And he has a production company there in Dunn County. If you'd like a copy of the full 3 hours, I'm sure you can go to rememberwhenproductions.com and order that video. Brian's a great guy. So now, the 100th year anniversary of the Force Center Church of the Nazarene from 2013. Next on Sunday Night Praise with the Spooner Church of the Nazarene.
Clifford Larrabee, and this is the 100-year celebration of the Force Center Church of the Nazarene. Sit back as our good friends from Remember When Productions pay tribute to 100 years of holiness.
Very friendly family atmosphere, and we really enjoy the love and the camaraderie that we get here at this church. Yeah?
Yep. So why do you like coming to church here?
Because it's small and everybody is personable, and I don't have far to drive.
All right.
I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
It was a small church. It was pretty basic. There was no indoor plumbing, no water, except water in the basement, where we didn't want it.
I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Okay.
My name's Victor Gibson, and I like that we don't have to wear nice clothes to church.
Gentlemen, I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
I really enjoy coming to church. Oh, it's a great church. I mean, everybody is so, they welcome you so, and you feel at home.
Good.
became the pastor of the Forest Center Church of the Nazarene in October of 2006, and it's a position and a calling from God that I do not take lightly. 100 years ago, when Reverend Tower was the first pastor of this church in 1913, he had a vision of holiness of heart, that people could be saved and sanctified holy, kept from the grip of the sinful nature. And 100 years later, we still proclaim that here at the Forest Center Church. And it's truly an honor to be a part of that heritage. Not only that heritage, but I also grew up in this beautiful church as well. One of the former pastors of the Forest Center Church, who went to be with the Lord many, many years ago, C.W. Thornton, wrote this on December 26, 1948. At the foot of the beautiful pine-covered Larrabee Hill, in that part of northwestern Wisconsin known as Springbrook, County of Dunn, in a modest frame building known as the Forest Center Church. Majestic in its white simplicity, it stands as a monument to faith, hope, and righteousness. Within its hallowed walls each Lord's Day swell the grand old songs of our faith, from holiness unto the Lord. And each Wednesday night finds worshipers gathered for prayer and praise in this house of the living God. And after 100 years, the same is still true.
Well, my mom and dad was Everett and Goldie Larrabee, and you want to tell them how we were connected? Well, our grandpa, our dad's dad, Charles Albert Larrabee, he and his brother helped start the church back in 1913.
And the brother's name was?
Lamont Larrabee. Those were the only two boys, I believe, in that family. It was kind of a large family, but the rest of them were girls. And my grandpa went by the name of Bert, because his middle name was Albert.
I want to take you back to 1912. Just down the road from the Forest Center Church, before it ever existed, about 5 or 6 miles, in the little township of Dunn, a little church known as the Louisville Episcopal Methodist Church. D.D. Tower was the pastor. And he called a man by the name of Earl Curtis, an evangelist, to come and preach revival. Earl Curtis, he preached a firebrand revival, holiness. But the problem was that most of the people of that church rejected it. And it wasn't long when God put a vision upon Reverend Curtis's heart, that Reverend Curtis, along with Effie Miller and both of their wives, they came to help start the great work of the first ever Nazarene church in Wisconsin. They arrived from Binghamton, New York on November 27th, 1913. They didn't even know if a church was going to be built. And two of the men from that little church, Lamont Larrabee and Bert Larrabee, brothers. Lamont actually was my great-grandfather, and Bert was my great-uncle. They set out for town with the team of horses to get lumber to build the church. And they began to build when the men returned. And during that time, while on his knees in prayer, Reverend Curtis was crying out to the Lord, what do we have to do? Where are we going to build this church? And God spoke to Reverend Curtis and showed him where to build the church. The original spot of the church is just over the hill from where we are now. And he went to see a Mr. Cummings, a Mr. E.O. Cummings, about receiving the land. And Mr. Cummings was very gracious, and he donated the land of the church. But you know, there's an old saying, when God moves, the devil builds a chapel nearby. See, they were meeting in the Forest Center schoolhouse, but there were people that didn't like that, so they locked the doors of the schoolhouse.
Well, from the history, they had revival services in the Forest Center area, and I think it started like in Louisville. But they used the Forest Center School to start their services together, a small group. And then after, I think it was 8 days, the school decided that they couldn't hold services in there anymore. And whoever the evangelists were at that time, they thought that there should be a church in that community. And so the two brothers got together and said, well, they would be building the church. So they went to town, and of course in those days by horse and buggy, and they brought back the lumber. And I understand from the history that the people that were left there, like they started clearing the land because they got it from the Cummingses. And
The land was across the road from where our grandpa Bert Larrabee lived.
But it wasn't long that the men, Bert Lamont, ended up going back to town to get another load of lumber, and the church was built. And on December 14th, 1913, under the permission and direction of District Superintendent F.J. Thomas, get this, Evangelist Reverend F.E. Miller dedicated the church. What a tremendous testimony. And it wasn't long after that that Reverend D.D. Tower was called to be the first pastor of the Forest Center Church of the Nazarene. Since 1913, there have been many great preachers that come through this church and through the doors of this church. I don't have information on all of them, but I wish I did. But I would like to recognize their service. As I spoke earlier, Reverend D.D. Tower was called as the first pastor of this church in the year 1913, stayed until September faithfully of 1918. Then Julius Miller was the next pastor and was with the church until September of 1919. And then Reverend A.J. and Clara Laird became the next pastor and wife. And during the year they pastored the church, a house was purchased, and they moved onto the lot up to the time of the fire in 1959. Now in September of 1920, Reverend J.W. Waltz was called and served the church faithfully for 5 years. Then the next pastor was Reverend George Cornelius, whose pastorate was for 1 year, from September of 1925 to September of 1926. And then in September 26 to September of 28, Reverend Yeating became the pastor. And then for another 7 years, they got another faithful pastor, Earl Stevens, and he left in 1935. The next pastor was Reverend H.H. Sivenpiper. It was during his ministry in the summer of 1937 that the church was enlarged and a basement was built. There's a lot of neat stories about that basement. Some of the kids that are still around that grew up in the church when it used to be over the hill used to talk about when they put boards on the floor to walk across the water. Reverend Sivenpiper left in July of 1937. Reverend J.A. Wright came in July of 1937 and remained with the church until 1941. And then Reverend C.W. Thornton was the next pastor and remained 3 years, leaving to attend Olivet Nazarene College. And then it was Reverend D.C. Eastman who came to the church in 1944, resigned at the end of 1 year and 9 months. And then in 1946, Reverend Perm Gustafson came to the church and stayed until August of 1948. I tell you what, Perm Gustafson and his wife Louise and their children were precious people. Of course, I wasn't around when they pastored here. It was before I was born. But I knew Perm for many years. They used to live in Mattoon when he retired. Just a little ways from the church there in Mattoon, the Nazarene church. And I used to visit him. He always had a testimony. He always had a joy in his heart. And I remember interviewing him on a video one time when we took the video of the 75th church anniversary. And I don't know if me or somebody else was interviewing him. They asked him how he was doing. He says, "I'm doing good." And he says, at his old age, "I feel young, though." There was a man that loved the Lord. Well, after Reverend Gustafson left, Reverend C.W. Thornton returned and was pastor until September 30th, 1949. And then Reverend Sherrill D. Smith arrived from California on August 1st of 1951, and he stayed until August 15th of 1954.
I guess my memories are started more when the Sherrill Smith was here, he and his wife. One thing I remember about them is Mrs. Smith had a crazy quilt, or patchwork, or crazy quilt.
Yeah.
And she always had us try to find the smallest piece on that quilt. So we would have to be hunting on that quilt to find the very smallest piece on there. And I think it was very, very small, because a crazy quilt is just made up of lots of different kinds of material in various size pieces.
And they had the young people come into their house a lot. They didn't have children of their own.
Reverend Dale Seidel was called to fill the vacancy on August 19th of 54, and he stayed until December of 1956. Then Mr. and Mrs. Reverend Schnell, they remained until November 2nd of 1958, coming January of 57. And then the McVeys came, the McVeys family. They came on December 1st, 1958. What a wonderful couple, wonderful family, served on the Wisconsin district for so many, many years. I know Mrs. McVey yet, and when I go to district conventions and I get to talk to her, what a sweet lady. They were actually here when the parsonage caught on fire during their time here at the church. Everything was destroyed, and the local newspaper said that the pastor had to borrow a pair of trousers from somebody so he could at least get up and preach. And there was a great outpouring for them, and the parsonage was rebuilt and dedicated.
That there was a fire in, was that 1959? About?
I think so, yes.
And I don't recall what started it, if it was a chimney fire or...
It had something to do with the furnace or something in the basement there.
And that was when Reverend McVeigh and his family was there. They had 4 children, so the house did burn completely down. And they came in, lived with my parents and us until I think they were able to get into a house that my dad and mom owned across the road from the church, which was their home farm, my dad's home farm. So then they were able to live there. I don't think they were here too much longer after that.
Well, after they were there a short time, and then they moved over to Janet Wowell's house, a little farther from the church.
Well, the dedication was held for the new parsonage on October 10th, 1961, with Reverend D.J. Gibson, the DS, who was officiating that. Now, the new parsonage was ready for a new pastor. The McVeys had left. And Wesley Burns and his family, they moved in and arrived on September 17th, 1961. And they were there for the dedication of the parsonage, and they left in 1963. Of course, I wasn't born until 71. I knew Pastor Burns. When my wife and I went to Cuba, Illinois, 20 minutes from Havana, Illinois, I used to joke, I went to pastor in Cuba, 20 miles from Havana. Well, Reverend Burns had his last ministry during the late 1990s in Havana, Illinois. And he was what we call the zone facilitator. What a special man, what a sweet man he was. And he was the one that was there when I came to the church as a zone facilitator and sat me down with the church that I was interviewing at. And he says, you know, the wife doesn't have to say much at these pastor interviews, but if she does and says she's going to get involved in stuff, he says it's a little icing on the cake. What a sweet man. And he's retired today and just has a great time. We had a great ministry throughout his career. In 1963, Wesley Burns moved on in his ministry, and Reverend Edward Coolidge came to the church. And as the church was over the hill, being appointed by the DS, he remodeled the church. And it wasn't too many years later that they decided in about 1965, 66 in there to take the church, bring it up over the hill, and build just across from the parsonage. And that was quite a project. They actually took part of the old church, the whole upstairs, and that's a part of the church today. As you walk in the church, it's the foyer and where the men's bathrooms and the offices are, or the office is, and the nursery, and they built around it. What a great project that was. And then in May of 67, we got a new pastor that came to the church. His name was Reverend Ronald Latimer, and he served the church faithfully. Reverend Latimer stayed with the church until September of 72. And then in 1972, Reverend Milton Wilson and his wife came to the church. These were the first first pastor and wife that I remember in the church. They stayed for about 3 years, and then I believe he went into retirement. What I remember about Reverend Wilson is he was kind of like a grandpa figure. After he left the ministry, I remember all 5 of us kids and Mom and Dad driving down to Indiana where they lived and visiting them. And my dad and Reverend Wilson, they got along just great. I remember my dad called from a payphone, and Reverend Wilson, just a sweet man, old man, answered, "Hello. Yes, this is the insurance guy," or something like that. And I'd like to know if I can stop by your house. I got my family. And Reverend Wilson thought he was serious. He says, yeah, sure, come. You can all stay here. We really need a place to stay, and I need to talk to you. This is your insurance man. And then after Reverend Wilson figured out who it was, he says, "Jim, you bugger." He was a great man, and I still have some fond memories, even as little as I was when he was here.
He was a very jolly guy.
Reverend Wilson, Milton Wilson.
And he'd come over here off and on, him and his wife. And I don't know if I should mention this, but one time we had little goats.
Ah.
And it was cold. They were just little babies. Like any hillbilly, we brought them in the kitchen and warmed them up. Well, Reverend Wilson come over, and he said something like he was hungry, so Jim made him some pancakes. And I said, "Doesn't that bother you, eating pancakes and goats under the table?" No, he says.
You were pretty close with Reverend Wilson, Dad.
Close to all the pastors.
July 1st of 76, Reverend Mr. and Mrs. Robert Short came to the church. His wife's name was Becca, and she was a beautiful, beautiful pianist, a beautiful singer, and she's still active in music today at her church, and they did a wonderful job while they served here at the church.
I come to church one Wednesday night, and for some reason Alice beat me to church. Alice Larrabee. And she says, "Jim, come here." I go to, she says, are them watermelons there? Or no, are them squash there? She says. I says, "No, them are watermelons." Oh, she says, he told me I could take one home, and he also told me I could take one. I just said, yeah. But then I says to Reverend Short, I says, them aren't watermelon. Them aren't squash. They're watermelons. They aren't even beginning to get ripe. "Oh, quick, help me take these out behind the church." I says, "For what?" He says, "Forrest is coming, and he'll have a little boogie if I give him away a watermelon." give away green watermelon. That was a funny. And I don't know if I ever told Forrest about that or not. But we took the I think he had 2 boxes in there, huh?
I don't know.
2 boxes of watermelons out behind the church. So after church was it, and I don't know what he did to dispose of them. If he dug a hole and buried them or what. But I don't know, Forrest, if you're listening, I don't know if you ever heard this one.
After Reverend Short left the church, Don Lemming came to the church and stayed until August of 1980 when he moved to another pastorate. He was a fun guy. I remember his 2 boys, Barry and Don. Barry was always a jokester. Sweet family. Reverend Lemming used to go coon hunting. Always did stuff with my dad and even worked for my dad. And I remember him coon hunting with that little light on top of his hat. And he was a lot of fun. Well, after the Lemmings left, Reverend Don Olson and his wife came. Don was a minister with the Salvation Army. Reverend Don and Harriet Olson were here from September 1st of 1980 until March 30th of 1983. And they were a fun couple and would always do a lot for people, did a lot of hospital. On April 17th, 1983, Reverend Carlton Zert and his wife Leela came to the church. He stayed here until 2006. What a tremendous ministry he had here at the Church of the Nazarene at Forest Center. When he retired at about 90 years old, he was recognized as the oldest active pastor in the Church of the Nazarene doing what he did. What a sweet couple. And Carl, I always remember him saying, the only animal that gets bigger after it dies is a fish. You can go figure that. Leela was a sweet lady, and Carl was a sweet man, and we still miss him today. And Carl went to be with the Lord, and Leela lives in Menominee, and they're very much treasured in our... I have a lot of great memories here at the church growing up, youth group, and the different kids that come and gone. I remember spending a lot of summers in Bible school with different kids. My cousin Maria Larrabee, my cousins Jenny and Joey Hemingway, friends like Becky and Jennifer Hotchkiss. Of course, that's not their last names now. But it was under the ministry of this church that I found Christ. You know, I grew up in the church and knew some things, and I remember going to youth group with Melvin Larrabee, my cousin, who was teaching. And I know Melvin to this day, he probably thinks, oh, are those kids ever listening? You know. But I remember, I don't know if it was a Wednesday night or a Sunday morning, in Sunday school, Melvin was teaching. It's not enough just to go to church. It's not enough just to say you're a Christian and go through the motions. I'm paraphrasing what he said. But you have to ask Jesus into your heart. Ask him. And I remember after Melvin said that, I went home and the radio was playing, the local radio station WWIB was playing songs like The Storm Passes By, In a Twinkling of an Eye, and at the kitchen table, nobody else around, I said, Dear Jesus, come into my heart, be my Savior. I don't know the exact words. And I'm telling you the peace that came through my heart, the joy that came through my heart. And I'm one of the pastors that came out of this church. There's been, you know, a number of pastors who have attended this church, weren't pastors when they started, but the church had an influence. Some of the pastors I know of, like my uncle, who would be my great uncle, E.W. Larrabee, grew up in this church. I know that Elvin Hayes, the evangelist, who preaches all over the country for the Church of the Nazarene, and now is living in Olathe, Kansas, with his wife Sharon. He's held revival here, great evangelist over the years. Elvin used to come to church here from time to time. Steve Kreitz, who's been faithfully serving in the Wisconsin district for a long time.
Alice Larrabee, she said she saw there was a mouse came in up on the platform, and she don't know how Gertrude got up on the piano bench, but she did. Oh. And of course that happened to me once too, when I was playing the organ there, and I don't like mice, so it came across there, and of course people in the audience saw it coming, I didn't, so I did finish the song though, and got out of there.
I wouldn't have. I'd have been out of there, song finished or not.
Well, like Grandpa said, you know, the night he got saved, they called it religion back then, but our pastor don't like where he got religion. He wants to call it salvation, which is, to me, if you got religion, you got salvation. Well, anyway, he got religion, and he said, how'd that go? Well, the evangelist wouldn't leave him alone, but he says, you know, the two I wanted the most, I never got. I always remember that story.
What two?
Chew tobacco.
Oh, I thought you said that.
No.
I thought you said the two of them.
No, the two. The two he wanted the most, he never got.
Well, I'm kind of hard of hearing.
I want to thank you for your love and your support and interest in our church and all those in our church over the last 100 years. Many saints have come and gone. Many of them will hold a special place in my heart that had an influence on me. People like Melvin Larrabee, people like Merle and Mabel Larrabee, people like Libby Harshman, people like Agnes Grutt, people like my grandpa and grandma, Clifford and Grace. The list goes on and on. Many of them had an influence upon me. I think of Uncle Merle sitting back there when he used to pray, "Oh Lord, help us to cling to the old rugged cross." The pastors that have had influences upon my life. And I thank Jesus Christ for making this little church a light to the community. And I pray that our light doesn't go out, but that as long as Jesus tarries, even if it's another 100 years, we will still tell people that the only answer to today's mixed up turmoil is Jesus Christ and Jesus Christ alone. I want to close with another reading from C.W. Thornton from December 26, 1948. He wrote this: "One by one the years have swiftly passed, bringing their bright, happy times as well as those trial and testing. Many people have been touched in one way or another by the Four Center Church. Some have passed on to their eternal award. Others are out in special service, while others are scattered here and there, members of our sister churches. Eternity alone won't reveal how far-reaching the influence of our church is broadening as the years go by, and we who have so much light are responsible for so much."
I love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. Love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. What a sight just to see all the happy faces praising God in heavenly places. What a thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. Let's sing verse 1. Oh, what a joyous love affords when we meet in one accord, and we lift our hearts in praise unto the Lord. There's no place I'd rather be than with the one who's been set free. I'm so glad I'm in God's great big family. I'll sing it. I love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. Praise the Lord. I love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. What a sight just to see all the happy faces praising God in heavenly places. What a thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. It can be just anywhere, two or three are gathered there, that the Spirit of the Lord will be there too. There's no fellowship so sweet, there's no thrill that can compete with the thrill I feel whenever God's children meet. Oh, let's sing it. I love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. Love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. What a sight just to see all the happy faces praising God in heavenly places. What a thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. On that great reunion families will all be gathered home. That will be the greatest thrill we've ever known. Let's sing it together. I love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. Love the thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people. What a sight just to see all the happy faces, praising God in heavenly places. What a thrill that I feel when I get together with God's wonderful people.